Hi everyone, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Let's wait for a few seconds for everyone in the waiting room to join us in the main plenary session. Okay, while we wait for participants to move from the attendees room to the panelists to the main session, my name is Himanshu Shekhar. I have the pleasure to be part of the Climate Academy team for 6 years, and on behalf of all the partners, United Nations University, Institute for Environment and Human Security, Munich Re Foundation, UN Climate Change, and International Organization for Migration, it's a pleasure to have you all with us. We are here for the very first open event of the 2023 Climate Academy on planned relocations, a topic that is very close to our heart, a topic that is very sensitive and very central to the policy making. Over the course of this week, we will be having a series of different in-depth sessions on topics related to planned relocation. And today, as the very first topic, why do we need to talk about planned relocation? Why this topic itself? A topic, very frankly, a couple of years ago was very sensitive, still remains sensitive in the policy making process. And we could not have asked for a better panel to untangle some of the complex issues regarding the issue of planned relocation itself. Before we go into the panel, let me introduce someone who has been a great supporter of the Academy program, Renate Bleich. Renate, you are the chairperson of Munich Re Foundation, and the Munich Re Foundation has been the key pillar of the Academy program since the beginning. Renate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Himanshu. Thank you for your kind words. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from my side as well to everyone who is tuned in. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this opening of the Climate Academy 2023 on behalf of Munich Re Foundation. As Himanshu has mentioned, we have supported the Climate Academy program for a long time. It's a program that we do in coordination and cooperation with UN University and also in collaboration with the UN Climate Change Secretariat. And for this year, we also have as a special partner on board the International Organization on Migration. And I'm really thrilled and happy that we have this great group of organizations together to do this year's Academy. And thank you so much to these organizations and to all the dedicated teams. I can't mention all the different people involved. That would take too much time, but thank you to everyone who is involved and who has put a lot of time and effort into making this happen. Thanks. Yeah, this cooperation on the Academy has been going on for many years now, and we are grateful for having these exceptional partners on board. And let me just give you a brief overview on why we are doing this Academy program. The Academy is all about collaboration of researchers, of policymakers, and of practitioners to address various aspects of climate change. And we strongly believe that this collaboration is key and is necessary to actually come up with strategies and solutions to address the challenges posed by climate change. And the Academy really is about exchanging knowledge and experience. It's about initiating further research and addressing and closing knowledge gaps, which we feel is really important. And also, and very importantly, it's about bringing science to policy, to inform climate policy on the international, on the national, and on the local level. And hopefully also, and we've seen this in past Academy programs, this collaboration is supposed to go on beyond these Academy weeks. It's supposed to be fruitful for a long time to come. We hope to grow a network of all the Academy participants, and we hope that they continue to work together. So this year's Academy focuses on planned relocation in the context of climate change. And we have chosen this topic because we really feel it's a pressing issue and we feel that it needs more attention. And we feel it needs exactly the kind of collaborative work that I've just been talking about. And we feel that there is the need for more knowledge and to actually find ways to include this knowledge into policy making. And I'm thrilled to have this great group of participants that will share their insights and their work during the course of this week. So thank you all for participating and being a part of the Academy. And also, I would like to thank all other panelists and speakers that we have in during this week on the various sessions. It's great that you can join, and I'm really looking forward to all the interesting discussions and presentations. And with this, I hand over to you, Himanshu. Thank you so much for being the moderator today and for being a key organizer of the Academy for a long time. Thanks, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Renate, for the kind support we have received from the foundation. And it has been a journey that we have gone together for last 16 years as United Nations University and Munich Re Foundation and UNFCCC and increasingly other partners. This year, for example, I am. The topic of planned relocation. And that brings me to the very first speaker we have today with us, Professor Emeritus from University of Florida, Anthony Oliver Smith. We fondly call Tony. The topic of planned relocation. Let's dive right into it. It's a topic that is sensitive. It's a topic that is extremely essential to talk about, but at the same time, that also carries a lot of stigma and a sort of melancholy in itself. Planned relocation means we have to move out from where we are. But do we need to talk about this in the policymaking context? So, would you like to share with us what's your relation with this topic is and why to talk about planned relocation?
I would like to just briefly introduce myself. My name is Anthony Oliver Smith, Tony, as I'm usually called. I have been working in the area of hazards and disasters and resettlement since roughly 1970. I would like to thank the UNU-EHS and David Durand-Delacre for inviting me to speak today. My association between 2005 and 2010 with the UNU and the Munich Re Foundation has been one of the richest intellectual experiences of my professional life. And personally, the friends I made during my tenure as a Munich Re Foundation Chair on Social Vulnerability continue to be among my most valued. So those of you who are out there who are part of that, hi. Okay, so why speak about planned relocation, which is the introductory topic? And I guess that there are two main reasons that in effect seem pretty straightforward, but are complex. The first is that there are huge numbers of exposed and vulnerable people who are being displaced, and those numbers are only going to grow. In that context, I think it's important to note that there has been far more attention paid to displacement in the climate change community than to the resettlement process. This underscores the importance of this webinar. The sheer complexity of resettlement is daunting. The second reason is that responsible agencies and organizations, those tasked with resettlement projects, generally don't understand or handle relocation or resettlement very well. It's a very complex process involving the reconstitution of economic life, political structure, environmental relations, and the reinterpretation of social and cultural values and priorities. In short, it's the reconstitution of a community. And that's not something that can be done by administrative fiat from outside. However, resettlement projects are largely seen, or have been largely seen, as infrastructural projects that are produced by government officials, planners, and reconstruction companies. Social scientists may sometimes be called on for input, but like affected people, their input is only marginally attended to in final decisions. So let's talk about the numbers first. First, we have to recognize that in climate change, planned relocation won't happen in every case. But climate change effects combined with local vulnerabilities frequently lead to displacement that then may lead to relocation or resettlement, whether preemptive, planned, or unplanned. Also, the numbers sometimes are hard to count. Sometimes because people are on the move, and sometimes because displacement is only temporary. So we don't really know actually who's been displaced when and how in every case. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center says that 32.6 million people were displaced by disasters in 2022. Of those, 21.1 million were displaced by flooding and drought. But the 21 million or 20 million more or less is now close to a yearly average. However, as I said, displacement is only often a temporary condition. When it becomes resettlement or relocation, it tends to be permanent. One of the reasons it may become permanent is that land becomes unusable, either through a variety of processes like desertification or indeed even submergence. That makes return impossible. The second reason as I said, is that generally responsible agencies and organizations don't understand or manage relocation very well. But we need to make an important distinction here first. Those of us who work in Latin America distinguish between relocation and resettlement. We refer to relocation as a movement, usually over very short distances, or fairly short distances, for moving people out of acute exposure to risk from one place to another, but another not very far away. So it doesn't entail major shifts in economic, environmental, political, social, or cultural values, practices, or priorities. Resettlement, on the other hand, actually involves the movement of individuals and communities that substantially threatens or actually changes economic, environmental, political, social, and cultural values, practices, and priorities. And this radical change will challenge people in different ways, according to age, gender, class, and all the other axes around which communities very often organize themselves. So resettlement is much more than a housing project, which it is often taken to be. Some people may use the terms interchangeably, but as I say, those of us who work in Latin America do not. So I'm going to be using the term resettlement going forward, largely for personal comfort, I guess. It's what I'm used to using. Most of all of the millions of people that are displaced are facing a huge set of challenges at both the individual and the community level. Every one of these challenges and problems may entail significant losses and damages. So what is lost in resettlement? First thing to realize is that loss is inevitable in resettlement, and resettlement cannot replace what is lost. But there are at least two kinds of losses and damages. There's the loss of land, houses, jobs, access to resources, livelihoods, essentially economic losses. Losses that can be, pertain to commodities that are both material in terms of goods, sometimes known as tangible, and non-material or intangible, commonly known as services. All of these losses and damages can be rendered or quantified in terms of economic value arrived at in market exchange. But many of these losses entail another kind of loss, namely non-economic loss and damage, which resists quantification, which continues to be problematical at levels of theory, policy, and practice. I want to focus on the importance of non-economic loss and damage in resettlement, because failure to understand and account for this non-economic loss lies behind many resettlement projects' failures. Excuse me. So non-economic losses pertain to material goods and non-material services, but they have aspects that are ignored by formal economic methods of valuation, and therefore they get left out when assistance or compensation is being debated and planned. While aspects of non-economic loss and damage can be quantified or monetized, the metrics really don't come close to capturing the nature of the gravity of the losses they cause. The problem has been recognized by both the IPCC and the UNFCCC in the Warsaw International Convention on Loss and Damage, now 10 years ago, 2013. But non-economic losses and damages, particularly those associated with resettlement, remain highly problematical, both theoretically and in policy formation. As a matter of fact, just last month, a colleague of mine, Robert Albro, from American University, published an article called "Accounting for Non-Economic Loss, Climate Displacement and the Meaningful Omission of the Tangible" in the Journal of Cultural Policy, in which he basically goes through in great detail all of the theoretical issues involved and their problematical status in the formation of policy. So generally, the losses and damages from displacement or resettlement produce major forms of stress: physiological stress, psychological stress, and sociocultural stress. But at stake is not only the loss of the physical context in displacement and the associated knowledge and materials and practices, but the potential loss of cultural and symbolic meaning that's embodied in those features. Those features that are central to understanding the world. And here I draw on the work of other colleagues, Ted Downing and Carmen Garcia Downing, in considering the losses of those cultural features, such as the loss of place, environment, land and terrain, or home, family, house, property, and past. That is, the loss of the lived experience, history, and tradition. These encompass a host of meanings and may evoke deep feelings of sadness and grief, which are expressions of affect. So while displacement and resettlement destabilize pre-displacement culture, emerging in its place in the resettlement project is a project that is very dissonant, that undermines the organizational principles of the pre-displacement culture. And it undermines the capacity to respond effectively to the new challenges, creating even more stress and exacerbating the sense of loss. Unfortunately, such expressions of affect, despite being widely documented, have gained much less attention in resettlement planning, which has focused primarily on material aspects such as infrastructure and service delivery. Excuse me. Although they represent serious risk of project failure, the effective dimension of loss and the ensuing anguish have proven very, very challenging to the policy world. In addition, differences in priorities and needs perception between those outside the community, outside authorities, and impacted people very frequently impair the implementation of resettlement. So, notwithstanding these challenges, there are resources that resettled people can call upon to reconstitute their community. And many of them are drawn from the history and the culture of the community. So what can be done to address these losses? Well, resettlement planners and affected people need to work out a system where they can materially sustain themselves while the people themselves undertake the process of reconstituting a new routine culture. And the methods for taking these risks of cultural loss into account in planning requires another kind of metric. It requires adopting qualitative assessments of the role of different institutions and practices in the maintenance of cultural identity. For example, take the case of land and its valuable role in identity formation. Land, particularly in indigenous societies, is often held under traditional non-market forms of tenure, commonly associated with kin, clan, tribal identity, or ethnicity. Understanding how identity is constructed and reproduced through land use becomes therefore crucial in understanding its role in mitigating cultural loss and the ensuing forms of loss and grief. When loss concerns the grounding elements of culture, it can be devastated because it renders those basic aspects of life that gave life meaning. They now become meaningless. Even the planning of a resettlement project before anything else is done can threaten the sense of security that the pre-displacement culture afforded because it invalidates the trusted beliefs and assumptions. Resettlement for most people is something that is very often disbelieved. How could they possibly do this? In that context, we find that people grieve for their communities, for lost homes, and social and environmental contexts, and for culturally significant places and structures in ways that are very similar for the loss, very similar to mourning for the loss of a valued person. Transitioning through the grieving process is key to overcoming the losses experienced in displacement and resettlement. The commemoration of loss through the enactment of rituals on secular and sacred holidays can keep alive the social existence of place and home. Symbolically important environmental features, objects, places, or people that provided anchors to community identity can be preserved or reconstructed, and they can play an important role in social recovery. They may need to be reinterpreted or reformulated versions that are keyed towards the present circumstances. But planners, at the very least, should be aware of important sacred and secular symbols and rituals so as not to undermine the grieving process by the destruction of these crucial cultural resources. So planners should depend on affected people to include in the resettlement plan adequate resources for the transition of important sacred and secular structures and their symbols, associated symbols and rituals into the new community. Planners and people together can work to preserve and enhance those cultural resources necessary to reduce the amount of cognitive restructuring and to recreate the basic cultural precepts behind all those familiar structures in the community, the institutions, the symbols, in the new context. foregrounding the decision-making and active participation of affected people. Decisions also enhances the sociocultural and the psychological innovations that directly address the constitution of a new routine culture.
Tony, I'm sorry to jump in. We might request you to wrap up maybe in the next 2 minutes if possible.
How about 30 seconds?
That would be great. Thank you.
Thus, recovery can be enhanced by establishing a continuity between the pre-displacement culture and the new culture, by addressing the cultural values and structures about human relations, human-environment relations, social relations, economic and other practices, spiritual and ritual sites and practices, so they can be reinterpreted and applied in the new context. This would include such things as former house types, production distribution practices, resettling people in social units of their own choice. All the losses experienced in displacement and resettlement, loss of place, loss of home, loss of past, all fold into what is the most, or can be the most devastating loss of all, the loss of meaning. The sense of loss that one is significant in the world, and within that there is a certain logic in one's existence. So until we truly understand what is at stake for affected people, and factor that understanding into the way we can work with and support affected people in the process of reconstituting community and culture, particularly after displacement by climate change effects, the process of resettlement will continue to impoverish people in a myriad of ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you took the debate right to the very sticking idea of loss and damage. Resettlement, relocation, loss and damage. The idea of it's not just about how do you measure it economically, but there is a lot that is being lost. It's a process that is cumbersome, that is difficult to start with and painful. And you very rightly summed up the debate across levels and disciplines and shared the experiences from Latin America. Tony, we deeply appreciate your intervention, your keynote address. Let me come to the audience. We are very thankful for your comments, for your participation. If you have any question, in the hurry of getting the session started, I forgot to mention that we do have the modality of questions and answers sometime like 20 minutes mark towards the end of the session. We will now be having 5-minute intervention from other panelists as their point of intervention, and then we will go into a discussion. So if you would like to ask us something, if you would like to ask any of the speaker directly, please put in the Q&A tab, and we will try to get back to your questions very quickly. Thanks a lot, Tony. With this, I'm very pleased to invite a colleague from the same campus here in Bonn, Donna. Donna, you work in the Vulnerability Subdivision of United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC. And I think what Tony was talking, knowing your own interest, I think this must have been very close to what you really care about, what you talk about indigenous communities. But at the same time, would you help us in understanding where planned relocation sits within the global climate change policy making process, particularly the work that UNFCCC does? Are there certain aspirations from parties to UNFCCC when it comes to planned relocation? And and if you would like to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Himanshu. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Anthony, for that very, very inspirational keynote. Hello, everyone, and greetings from the UNFCCC campus. I am Donna Lagdameo. I am currently the team lead of the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform Unit under the Adaptation Division, and currently also the officer in charge of the Vulnerability Subdivision. We are very happy to be part of this initiative, and as you all know, the Paris Agreement has really given this mandate to mobilize more ambitious climate action, not just by parties, but by everyone. And so this inclusivity is really something that we are all looking for, and initiatives like the Climate Academy is really a step towards this direction. We also really want to highlight the importance of strengthening knowledge generation and addressing knowledge gaps, especially knowledge that comes from those who are on the front lines. There is a clear recognition that vulnerable communities are not just vulnerable, they are also leaders in terms of initiating transformational climate action through tried and tested approaches, especially those implemented through generations by our indigenous peoples, brothers and sisters, and by local communities. So we are really this is the work of this Climate Academy, and the topic itself is something that is very much aligned with our priorities. I would like to veer away or highlight a different aspect in my intervention now, and really focus on the value addition of transformational climate action and the value addition of knowledge coming from on the ground experiences and approaches. The IPCC was very clear. We no longer have time, but it was also very clear to say that we can still do something. And doing something through identifying the risks people are facing and also the possible options is something that really that we hope we can achieve in this academy. Climate change is very complex, as already mentioned by Anthony. It is very difficult to solve. It has a lot of uncertainties. We need to do a lot of difficult trade-offs, and it pushes systemic boundaries to a certain extent. And at the end of the day, it is really a symptom of other problems. So this is really the topic of planned relocation presents to us or highlights that there is no single solution, and a combination of insights, tradition, culture, values, and approaches is important in ensuring that we find that right and customized approach in planned relocation. Planned relocation is a topic that is touched on in different areas in the negotiation. Of course, as Himanshi mentioned, it is very much in the loss and damage debate, but it is also very much in the issues highlighted by our indigenous peoples and local communities. It is also and these are topics that can be addressed in various work streams through adaptation planning and implementation, national adaptation plans, through finding those indigenous values and really shaping policies that will allow us to change our direction perspectives, and also. And this can happen at the international level, the regional level, and the national level. So there are a lot of entry points in addressing planned relocation. And of course, as you know, the international climate policy landscape is a continuing thing. It's not something that we can fix in one COP, but we are really hoping that the continued discussions through the academy, through your contributions, will help us find that entry points to ensure that what we do here will not end after the academy ends, but will really have the lasting impact, just like the past academies under this initiative. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are totally with you in terms of finding solutions and finding and really highlighting the leadership roles of our communities on the ground. And we hope that we can together identify the entry points at different levels and work in partnership with other work streams in the Secretariat. So all the best, everyone, and we look forward to a really exciting academy this year. Thank you, Himanshu.
Thank you so much, Donna. You rightly touched upon many of the points I have that I wanted to learn from you. Is this planned relocation on whether it is on the adaptation side, whether it is on loss and damage side, and how do we address this? I mean, does it really help to put it in one category or other? What are the policy mechanisms doing about it? Thanks a lot for your amazing summary of the policy process, where the gaps exist, because it provides us an amazing entry to the next point of discussion that would be coming from my colleague from United Nations University, David Durand-Delacre. I hope to get your surname right after all this time. And David, you would be talking about planned relocation in the broader context of research on climate mobility and what are the productive tensions out there. I like the framing of productive tensions, because let's be clear about it. Not one size fit at all. I mean, that is what Donna said, that is what Tony also said. So let's talk about planned relocation and climate mobility. And if you don't mind introducing your work and yourself.
Absolutely. So I'll start with a few words about UNU-EHS and the team that I work for. At the Institute here in Bonn, we're interested in risk, in vulnerability, and in adaptation to climate change and to associated environmental hazards. Specifically in the team that I work in, we've been doing a lot of work. We call it people-centered work, based mainly in qualitative methods, trying to understand the complexities of what's increasingly known as climate mobilities. So the relationship between climate change, its various manifestations, and the ways in which people move. Planned relocation has become an interest to us in this context, because as was already mentioned, it's one form of climate mobility, and there are others. And the other forms, displacement, voluntary migration, have received more attention than the resettlement process, as Tony already said. And so what we're interested in as researchers in a sort of UN related context is precisely to try and draw these links between a lot of the more local perspectives that Tony was presenting and talking about, and these broader policy agendas. And I think that's talking about productive tensions, that's this space that we're interested in exploring, the science policy space. How do we bring perspectives both from local communities directly into global policymaking processes, but also facilitate an understanding of how global policymaking functions for communities to be able to be heard in the best possible way, and going back and forth like this. When designing the program for the Climate Academy, we adopted a slightly sort of practical definition, which I first came across in work by the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which summarized planned relocation by basically saying it's a collective process that involves a group of people moving in a more or less permanent way, often permanent way, to an identifiable location connected to sort of an environmental risk. But as I think the conversation has already shown, starting even with such a definition, we quickly come to a number of problems or tensions or interesting areas that require deeper thinking and more contextual work of contextualization and research. So I'll just share a few of those general lessons as conversation starters, and I invite you to join many of the sessions throughout the week that will dig much deeper into them. But I think it's very clear, first of all, that this has already been covered a little bit, but that relocation is a process. And when we use the term planned relocation, we do it in a very careful manner, which is to say that we're not here to plan relocations, but to put them in a context where a decision has to be made about whether or not that's the right path forward for a given context, for a given group of people, for individuals within communities. And that's essentially the first step, is that relocation conversations need to start a long time before often the planning element begins. The second thing is that, and this has already been emphasized very rightly, is that it's not just a technical question, it's very much a political process. And it's important, and I think this is where research is very valuable, is we can bring to bear a lot of frameworks that are rooted in concepts of justice, concepts of human rights, questions around the allocation of responsibility to the question of planned relocation. Perhaps the most sort of evident tension for me is the one between autonomy in decision-making, the ability of communities to decide what path forward is best for them, whether that means staying or moving, and when and how and under what conditions. And that's autonomy on the one side, but on the other side, support. In a lot of cases, communities may not have the resources or the means to effect a successful relocation, whatever that means for them. And that requires external support. And this is where I think research and science policy work is very important to try and find ways in which external actors can be involved in the most productive fashion. And that requires a lot of dialogue between everyone involved. I think that conversation also needs to happen often between governments that might be implementing these sorts of policies, and they might also need external support in the sense of aid from the international community, whether it's technical assistance or funding. Another thing that I find very interesting is that we're very focused on climate-related relocations, but there's also clearly a longer history. And I think any of these conversations that we'll have will need to look into the past of other examples of resettlement because of infrastructure projects, because of colonial policies, because of extractivist mining industry practices that have led for people to be relocated or resettled, often under duress. And so even as we talk about climate-related relocations and focus on this, I think I invite everyone to think about also some of the tensions from the past, and understanding how relocations has happened before will be vital to doing better today. And maybe I'll just, I think my 5 minutes are probably reaching their end. So I'll focus on one last thing, which I find personally very interesting, is that relocation and the movement from one's home is potentially a very universal question. I think it has this potential to be something that we can talk about and that everyone will find something to identify in her, because it's about the meaning of home. It's about the connection of people and place and culture. And I think that has a potentially very broad appeal, and we can talk about this and how all of this is changing in very different contexts under climate change. And so even as context is everything for planned relocation, I think there is also a potential here to talk about something that is universal. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to expand further in conversation.
Thank you so much, David. Indeed, I have made many notes related to what you were reflecting on. I would be coming to you in the second part of this discussion, but that provides us the right opportunity to move on to Rachel. Rachel, you have been listening very patiently because your work sort of brings all this debate together from more an institutional perspective on how do we do what we need to do. So Rachel, you are doing your doctoral work at University College London in UK, and you would be sharing more towards how this knowledge, funding mechanisms, guidance, everything from across scales comes together, and how the national governments, particularly as one of the key decision makers, would have a say in this. Rachel, your 5 minutes start now.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Himanshu, for that introduction. Thank you for having me today, and to Tony for your thought-provoking keynote. My name is Rachel Harrington-Abrams, and I'm a researcher at King's College London, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to join this panel and share a bit about my work, which, as an introduction, is very relevant to this session because I focus on the interactions between the national and international policy domains. So I'll speak specifically to those levels today, and mainly the role of institutions and stakeholders that are supporting the relocation process. Especially my research focuses on understanding how knowledge, funding, technical guidance all flow from the international level to the national level, and equally how national governments are reshaping the international arena around adaptation and loss and damage policy broadly, and then relocation approaches more specifically. I particularly focus on what the approach to planned relocation and different perceptions on its use can tell us about how national governments are dealing with long-term planning for extreme climate impacts. I think building on the point that both Himanshu and Donna made previously about is it adaptation or is it loss and damage, and how we negotiate that space in particular is poignant and relevant to my work. So I just want to highlight two areas of research that are particularly relevant for our discussion today. The first is that there's really different approaches across national governments and country contexts to the use of relocation. So relocation is used and conceptualized very differently in different parts of the world. Among governments that are supporting relocations, they may frame their use of relocation or resettlement differently according to how they're approaching it in a given context. So as social housing policy, disaster risk reduction, disaster response, urban development, climate adaptation, loss and damage policy, and equally in each of these cases, there may be different national ministries that are in charge of that work. This also means where governments are working with external expertise or funding support, they might partner with an entirely different set of international institutions, depending on the relevancy of their distinct approach, and also to the pre-existing partnerships they might have with some of these institutions. There's a small set of governments that are supporting relocation specifically through a climate approach, so using existing climate funding channels, but there are many more that approach questions around relocation and current or future use of relocation through support from an entirely different set of stakeholders, such as development agencies, funders. These vast differences are exemplified in the regional variations in terminology and definitions that Tony highlighted, and extends to institutions involved at the international level. So that just points to some of the kind of coordination challenges when different groups have different understandings of the problem at hand and or how they approach it. The second point is that, building on that, there's an institutional gap at the international level. Understanding these different approaches to relocation at the international level is challenging because many different types of international institutions and stakeholders are working on planned relocation in some capacity, but under different frameworks. So similarly, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian response, working with IDPs, insurance frameworks, development agencies, and then, as mentioned previously, adaptation and loss and damage. So one project I've been working on to that end, together with Erica Bauer, who will be speaking later this week, is to explore some of the consequences of that institutional gap. The gap is particularly notable because in many ways, as mentioned previously, relocation is both conceptually and operationally distinct from other types of climate mobility. There's already some coordination happening around other types of climate mobility, such as through the work of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw Mechanism, but less explicitly so for planned relocation, even though it's to some degrees under that mandate. So why is it important what's happening at the international level, or for that matter, at the national government level when it comes to relocation? I think we can all agree the most important point here is that relocation is community-led, and so local experiences, lived experiences are a key and central point to the relocation process. From my research, I think what's happening at the institutional level is really key because there's a growing interest in the use of planned relocation, particularly in the context of climate change, as evidenced by the focus of this year's Academy. This evolution in interest at the multilateral level is highlighting some key questions, especially now as it's becoming more present in international spaces. So, for example, if you've been following the negotiations for the new Loss and Damage Fund, it's come up as a key point there. So these key questions include, what happens to different national approaches if more funding becomes available at the international level through one specific policy channel, such as loss and damage? It's also important to recognize that there are underlying power dynamics when international institutions and external funders get involved in supporting national policy. So who establishes the metrics for policy development and project delivery when there's external funding or technical support involved? So just to wrap up, I'll close with a few larger questions that could maybe kick off our discussion and are worth exploring around the current system as it has evolved and how it might change in the future. The first is, should international institutions be involved in planned relocation, and how? What role for the international community moving forward? And then what benefits or drawbacks would come from more open multilateral discourse and closer coordination between institutions around planned relocation? This is a really sensitive area, as has been said, but there's a lot more attention being paid in international spaces. So I think it's key to explore some of these questions here and beyond. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for also keeping the time and most importantly, leaving us with these questions. Because these are precisely the questions of, it's good to talk about something, but how do we do it? And the questions that you raised, Tony, if I may come to you in the very beginning of this question of, who does planned relocation and what are the right conditions to, or resettlement as you prefer to talk about, what are the right conditions for this? If I look from the periphery of this debate in the climate context, would not it be a bit like jumping the gun in a sense that if we provide a remedy for something that in a sense might not be counting the adaptive capacity of people involved? We have seen in the past that people persist staying in a place where research often says that, it's better to move out. So I know I'm throwing a bit of curveball there, but would you like to share experiences of what might be the right conditions for resettlement, or take on any of the speakers? You also have a few questions already, but maybe we take this one first and then we come to the questions from Q&A.
Okay. I have happened to be involved in precisely that kind of interaction or situation in my work in Panama with the Guna people who live on the coast, the Caribbean coast of Panama. And there are people who live on a whole series of islands that in effect are being threatened by a variety of things, among them climate change, basically tidal surge and storms, but also overcrowding because the islands are quite small. And they, in effect, much to their disappointment, in effect, have seen themselves forced to resettle to the mainland, where they once lived 150 years ago. So they still own land there. A colleague and I, Carlos Arenas, who is a human rights lawyer, originally from Colombia, did some work for an organization called Climate Displacement Solutions for a couple of years before our work was noticed both by the Panamanian government and by the Inter-American Development Bank. And so eventually our work was picked up by the IADB and the Panamanian government, and we functioned as kind of go-between between those institutions and the community. But at the same time, we were doing research that was oriented on how do you best plan for climate change displacement. So our working relationships tended to be quite good, but not always quite on the same page entirely. And so what we got was kind of a bird's eye view of the dynamics between national governments, international agencies, and local community. And we were kind of situated in a kind of middle area in all that. So the role that the IADB ended up wanting to play was to fund the planning process. That is to fund the planning outcome, not necessarily any of the actual physical construction, and to do a kind of review of what transpired. And a good deal of what I said today has been derived from that experience. What we learned was that there are fundamental tensions that not necessarily are destructive or that impede the interaction, but they must be worked out ahead of time. And how they're worked out is really a function of the dynamics of the relationship between the national government, the international agency, and between the personnel involved, and between the community. Now, in this case, and please stop me if I go on too long, because this is 5 years of work. In this case, the CUNA, in effect, took a very, very forthright role. They, in effect, realized the situation they were in. They didn't want to move, but they realized they had to. They also realized, and this is part of their history, they are perhaps the indigenous group that has best defended their cultural identity in Latin America. They're among the best, the most. And so, in effect, their relationships with the Panamanian government have been actually formalized. They are a region of Panama, but they have autonomy. And in effect, you show your passport when you cross into Gunayala, which is their region, just the same way as you would in crossing a national border. So they, in effect, were in a very good position to enter into this discourse with the Panamanian government, and as well with the Inter-American Development Bank. So this relocation has not transpired yet. They have and are well into the construction of the new community.
Yeah.
So, but the transition has not actually happened yet. And that to say that this is a successful process is to recognize that it's far from over.
Thank you so much. No, indeed, it's a complex issue, and sharing this best practice, as you said, from Panama. I mean, even their experience shows that there are a lot of tensions, as you said, and the right idea is to look at these tensions and work these ahead of time, instead of what normally happens that we address them as we go around. That brings me to the next question that I have in mind, but at the same time, I see questions flowing in through the Q&A tab as well. So may I request all the panelists to kindly go through the questions and pick them as you would like to address. But before I go there, I had two questions that I wanted to throw to our panelists, one maybe to Donna, one slightly towards Rachel. And the first question, maybe Donna, for you is that let's talk slightly more about the vulnerability part of the work that you do, particularly of the indigenous group. And we have often seen that this is a group that has been disproportionately affected from resettlements and relocations. So are there specific vulnerabilities that you would like to highlight, particularly when we think about processes such as National Adaptation Plan or any adaptation action? That could be of benefit. And the second question that Rachel, I wanted to bring to your attention was more about, does this division between adaptation or loss and damage, where the planned relocation is located, let's say in the policy arena, does it really impact the output of how do we address it? But at the same time, if you wish to address any of the amazing questions that are coming, feel free. We might have to go a bit speedy from here. So maybe Donna, you go first.
Hi, Thank you, Himanshu. Well, there are, as you rightly mentioned, indigenous peoples are among those always identified as a vulnerable group, especially impacted by climate change. And I think one of the reasons why they're vulnerable is because of the lack of recognition and the lack of systematic inclusion or lack of in at the national level. As you know, climate policies, just like TRR policies or what have you, it's a party-driven, country-driven approach, and the fact that there is a divide that is on the ground is also lessening the voice of indigenous peoples in the development and assessment of risks and in development of plans, etc. At the same time, this is also detrimental to policy making at the national level, because the countries are not able to fully also learn from how indigenous peoples and local communities have been adapting and have been addressing climate change for the longest time. So bridging the divide and how to bring in the indigenous peoples, local communities into the policy making is a way that was recognized by the Paris Agreement. And this is the inclusivity part of that we are trying to bridge here. And recognizing that they have indeed indigenous values that can change mindsets and can change the trajectories and allow us to identify transformative approaches and sustainable approaches. I think one of the areas that at the international climate policy making UNFCCC is party-driven process, and as such, all other observers or stakeholders remain as observers and are not part of the policy-making debate and negotiations. While there are a lot of entry points, now you can see constituted bodies really bringing indigenous peoples and local communities as representatives in their expert groups. And we have seen an exponential increase in terms of work plans of constituted bodies really wanting to bring in the knowledge and expertise from indigenous peoples and local communities. This is a sign that we are really trying to bring them in the process. However, at the end of the day, it's still a party-driven process. So parties will still decide. But there are entry points at the international level, at the national level, through national adaptation plans, and then so many other engagements through contributions in the knowledge generation and etc. So there are a lot of areas that we can use. And hopefully really transcend from seeing indigenous peoples and local communities as just vulnerable people. At the end of the day, we can learn a lot from all these groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. And just if I can request you maybe towards the end in your concluding part, if you can point to some of the working executive committees or constitutive bodies within the UNFCCC framework that could be of interest, that are publicly accessible for our attendees, that would be very much of appreciation, because there is a lot that is happening, and a lot of that is public. Simply, we don't know what is accessible, and just knowing a bit would be helpful. Thank you so much. Rachel, we come to you. Tony, you would like to add something?
Yeah, sure. Just very quickly, the issue, a couple of issues. One brought up by in a chat. But the issue of indigenous people's participation with the CUNA, there was no problem with that. They are used to participating fully in the decisions that affect their community. But one of the interesting things that came out was that when we were working there, we acquired collaborators. And those collaborators, in effect, although they had different backgrounds, became very expert in the whole issue of displacement and resettlement. So in effect, we have not been back to the community since before the pandemic, but we now have people there, indigenous people, Kuna, who are actually now taking the lead in the way that the eventual resettlement will take place. The other question was the question of cultural preservation, that I was asked if cultural preservation or the preservation of culture was a priority. Not necessarily. The idea that you can't recreate or reconstruct culture, but the idea of making sure that certain elements make the transition to the new environment as an adaptation to the shock of resettlement. But there is no idea that somehow or other you're going to recreate, that they will recreate, because they will change in that circumstance. So there will be a new culture, and it will have new values, perhaps, but it is not a goal to actually recreate or preserve the pre-displacement culture, because that's not possible.
Thank you so much. Indeed, that answers some of the questions that also came through chat. Rachel, so would you like to bring us back to the adaptation versus loss and damage and why it matters in the policy making?
Definitely. So I think Donna kind of highlighted some of these points, but relocation comes through the UNFCCC process under adaptation. It was first introduced within the Cancun adaptation framework. Article 14F was kind of the first time relocation was introduced in that space. So some of that work flows through the development of national adaptation plans, through adaptation communications for Annex 1 parties. It also increasingly comes through the loss and damage space, through the work of the Task Force on Displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism. And in the past year, especially, I think this was maybe to speak to one of the questions in the chat, but the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration around Loss and Damage Fund and the workshops that are taking place now, there's been some discussion around the use of relocation there as well. I think having these two different approaches is good because it's expansive. It allows for all the different approaches that exist. Some governments are looking to explore current future use of relocation through a loss and damage angle. Some communities, I think, are asking for that kind of support. In other places, there's a different sort of framing from adaptation where it's seen as a proactive adaptation action in advance of reaching a sort of loss and damage point. And I think having these different angles allows for these different conceptualizations of what the process of relocation means, both for governments and for affected communities, and how they maybe identify the point at which it may be appropriate to relocate. I think the question is most important from a funding perspective. If there is an expansive approach to that, where adaptation funders and loss and damage funders are including relocation in their kind of spectrum of policies that they're willing to support, that means that governments or communities that are seeking support can use whatever channel feels most appropriate to them. But if that's not the case, it may kind of channel people towards one sort of funding option that may not actually align with the way that is most resonant with them to frame the relocation process. There's also benefits going through in terms of technical guidance. So the Santiago network is one space where there could be more technical support around relocation. But again, that's a loss and damage approach, which would mean kind of following that loss and damage angle. Either way, there's kind of a certain normative framing associated with those ideas. What does it mean if you receive loss and damage funding to support your relocation process, but you actually maybe view it as a more proactive form of adaptation that's part of your adaptation planning. So what are these kind of external mechanisms and discourse and funding? How does that maybe reshaping the types of decisions that are being made on the ground in different country contexts? And then I think finally, what are we missing beyond that climate framing? So we're talking about adaptation and loss and damage, but there's many parties that engage in the UNFCCC process, but relocation is not part of that work that they're doing under the UNFCCC, and maybe it falls under their disaster risk planning or development work. So even just this kind of loss and damage adaptation question leaves out some of those groups as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. What I liked about this approach is that what you're advocating and what is happening in practice as well is that relocation in certain contexts falls slightly closer to adaptation. Hence, having access to adaptation fund adaptation mechanism is more contextually specific and helpful, while in certain cases it makes more sense for loss and damage debate. So having access to that as well, instead of finding the right answer whether it sits in loss and damage or adaptation, you really suggested a very pragmatic way forward. Thank you so much. Being pragmatic, David, we have too many questions coming in. I am going to ask our panelists to look at that, but would you like to start would you like to answer one question at least? You already have answered one in the chat box, but would you like to pick another one? Because I do have questions related to what you presented, but I'm afraid we are running a bit out of time as always.
Let's focus on what our audience is asking, and most of the questions in the Q&A are focused maybe on some of the other panelists' expertise. There's one that's coming through the main chat, which is about documenting all these research gaps and all these resources. I think I'm going to use that just to make a quick point to this, that we're talking about planned relocation. There's been a couple of efforts to map all of the case studies. There's a report by the Platform on Disaster Displacement called Leaving Place, Restoring Home, which has mapped over sort of 400 of these cases. I would invite you to look at that. And we'll share some more agenda setting pieces after the call. But basically, I think one of the things that's resonated with me the most throughout this conversation is that there's value in keeping a diversity of frameworks and categories in place, and also that we have to be quite careful about the categories we adopt going into any context. I think Tony's point about preferring resettlement is quite an interesting one, because we've gone into this process talking about planned relocation, but that word might suggest that relocating is ultimately the end point. And I think a certain openness to going into this process and making it fundamentally about working out what frameworks, what understandings, what different perspectives are at play here, what is the best path forward, what is the best future for community, and it should be essentially the center of relocation debates, and from my perspective, and I think that this idea of relocation being only one path to a better future is part of that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David. Let's spend 5 more minutes in trying to answer as many questions as possible, because we had requested our panelists to come with one specific set of takeaway message, and that is, if there are 2 actions that you would recommend for us to do to address the issues that you have mentioned regarding planned relocation and resettlement, what these would be and which actors. So this is something we would come to you, like, let's say in 5-7 minutes from now, as part of your closing remark. But for now, Tony, there are a few questions pointed towards you, and there are a few, Donna, towards you, and Rachel, so on. So please feel free to pick. May I just start with one that is geared toward Tony, and that one is asking for, or the other panelists as well, specific example of from Africa about sharing land loss and loss and damage, since land ownership modalities differ in that context. So would you have any, like the one you shared from Latin America, in case you would like to address that one? And there was one which may not be relevant, but also talks about the different association to land for different stakeholder communities, like the agrarian communities versus the pastoralist community and so on.
Well, not being an Africanist researcher, I'm kind of at a loss to actually give very specific examples, at least from the climate change context. I got into this field because of disasters, and when I got into it, I found that most of the work was done on development. So I began to do research on displacement by development projects, and there are many examples of in Africa, and the different approaches. For example, from I know there is research on pastoralists versus farmers in Africa on the issue of displacement. One of the interesting things is that one of the adaptations to drought in Africa, particularly in the Central Africa, is the fact that during droughts, pastoralists will actually relocate themselves or sedentarize themselves temporarily with farmers, and these are people that normally have a certain level of tension between them. So this idea of the flexibility of cultures in their adaptation to droughts is and to hazards in general, I think, is something that we really ought to pay attention to. We have, to some degree, the idea of disaster risk reduction in as part of indigenous knowledge. As I say, I can't give a specific climate change associated example.
Yeah.
But I do know that there's a historical and ethnographic knowledge base to illuminate this question. It's just not in my.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tony. In case there are other examples that our attendees would like to share, I know some of our attendees also have vast experience in the African context. Please feel free to use the chat function. Let me pick one last question. And Donna, this one is towards an issue that is coming time and again in the UNFCCC discussion, non-economic loss and damage. How can we better incorporate this? This is something we see in, of course, work on loss and damage in GLASS framework for a global goal on adaptation. So would you have any take on how non-economic loss and damage could be incorporated in discussions? Or where lies the possibility, let's say, not how it could be done better, but where lies the possibility, let's say, more pragmatic approach?
Oh, I'm sorry, who is this to?
No, please, go ahead, Anthony, you want to say something?
No, I just wasn't sure who was being asked the question.
Maybe Donna, you first, and then Tony, you can have a reflection on what Donna says.
Fine.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Well, in the Paris Agreement, non-economic losses was essentially put under loss and damage. So right now, the formal discussions on non-economic losses lie within that framing as a work stream under the Wars International Mechanism, and with the mandate of understanding and unpacking what this means and finding ways to address them. So right now we're bound by that. However, as you rightly mentioned, this is also coming up, especially now in the Transitional Committee, because the committee is asking very hard questions, which is really good. It recognizes that there are there are challenges in existing financial mechanisms, and that there are issues that are not being addressed by the current funding mechanisms. And so they are asking, what can we do better and how can we do it differently? And that is what the inputs from, for example, the expert group of non-economic losses and also the facilitative working group of the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform are really helping shape that. Let's think about it differently. Let's have a change in perspective in terms of how we address or we fund. If I remember correctly from the top of my head, the inputs that were contributed was like shift the mindset in terms of the funding timelines, not just the short term, but look at funding that will affect generations to come. And have that different kind of prioritization, or put nature at the heart of the interventions, and not simply based on economic measures, etc. So there are so while we don't have a specific work stream or specific constituted body on non-economic losses, it is actually seeping through. The essence of non-economic losses, values, indigenous peoples, etc., are actually influencing the different work streams: loss and damage finance, adaptation, and even mitigation for just to some extent, especially with the new Article 6.8. So there are, short answer to your question, if they will have a standalone NELS, I don't really know what the parties will decide, but my sense is it might be within what, because our parameter is the Paris Agreement, whatever is written there. So we probably will remain in that, but then again, it is influencing different work streams and different thinking processes. So it is
Indeed
fantastic opportunities, and then really let's capitalize on this entry points that we have right now.
Indeed, Donna, what you're saying, the pace of global climate change policy making, particularly in the last few years, has been really inspiring. We saw a fund being established for loss and damage in the very first place. And what we are talking about is this sense of attribution and quantification, and where it lies and how do we do it. I'm pretty sure, given the work that is happening in sometimes sooner than later, we would have a better mechanism to incorporate this. But with this, Tony, would you like to very quickly point to how can we do the monitoring or quantification of non-economic loss and damage better? I'm really running out of time, but maybe we try to answer this one and then we go.
Okay, first, flexibility. One of the things that's come up in this discussion is the role of how international organizations and national governments actually frame the problem, and how this creates problems at the ground level, because what happens at the ground level doesn't fit into the categories or frames that the national government or the national organization plays. But in terms of how to approach non-economic loss and damage, I think you have to adopt a different way of I don't like to use the word metric, because you're not measuring, you're assessing, you're describing. These are, and in effect, you need to honor a different kind of data. Not everything can be reduced to quantitative measures, particularly money. So in effect, if we do not admit to our analysis of the situation and how that informs what we do, then we, in effect, are imposing well, not so much imposing as simply losing really important information because it doesn't fit our analytical categories, which are primarily quantitative. So this requires a cultural change, an institutional cultural change. And that's something that actually runs counter to all of the orienting values of the institution. That is, how do you measure? How do you assess an impact You assess it in quantitative terms. And so this requires a different kind of logic, what it really requires is cultural change on the part of the institutions.
Indeed, indeed. No, I very much agree. I think the way climate change regarding related funding mechanisms are, they have a long way to go. Not just the quantification, but a more value-based understanding of the impact to start with could be one way to go. Thanks a lot for this direction, Tony. We are in last 4 minutes, and that unfortunately means we would not be able to answer some of the questions that are remaining. But, and as I hope for next sessions that are coming, we are going to answer some of these questions. Today is just the agenda setting session. I will invite David to maybe brief us about the sessions that are also planned for tomorrow, for example. But then I ask, maybe Rachel, starting with you first, your take-home message. You can have any message you like, but if you wish, you can use the questions that we provided you. Actors, your favorite or most important actors, not actors where you see, let's say, a lot of responsibility, and 2 things they would love to do, they need to do to make planned relocation, what you prefer them to do.
Yeah, so first I think would be to actors, stakeholders in the international arena. I think we all agree this is a really sensitive topic, but I think if looking at the way things are going in negotiations, funders, different policy spaces, if there's going to be more conversation around planned relocation or resettlement, I think it's important to open up the conversation, look into what might be relocation under a different name. So as development, infrastructure projects, there's all these different approaches, communities, governments that are working on these issues, but from really different framings. And so who might not be part of that conversation and whose kind of knowledge isn't included, I think is really important for us to kind of interrogate at the international level, because right now it's kind of through one very specific lens. I think for researchers working at the national level, really interesting would be to have more research into kind of policy frameworks and funding channels. There's an incredible array of case study research, but less is kind of known about what different national policy landscapes look like. What are the institutional obstacles that communities encounter when navigating, looking for opportunities for relocation, if that's something that they desire. So like there's a really useful example of this that Robin Bronin and Stuart Chapin wrote about the policy landscape in the US and some of the legislative obstacles that communities encountered and administrative obstacles. So I think that'd be a really interesting space for research for people with kind of more in-depth on the ground knowledge to understand more about the policy context in different parts of the world beyond kind of the individual case study context. Thank you. Thank you
so much. I must take this time to also request you, if you would like to share some of the names through chat, if feel free. If not, because as the community, it becomes a bit of resource. Some of these names are very obvious to us, maybe not for others that much. So if there is any specific recommendation or name that you wish we all should be familiar with, please put in the chat. And that reminds me to especially thank Alberto, Angela, and Friedrich for the inputs they have provided through chat, particularly sharing the cases from Africa. It's really amazing what the group can do. We know there are many people in the audience who have amazing expertise, and we try to involve you as much as possible. We appreciate your patience as well. I know you're connecting from different parts of the world, and it's really late and really early in different parts of the world. That means concluding remarks now. Donna, coming towards to you. Any concluding parting words you would like to share? Either could be actor-specific, action-oriented, or anything else you wish for us to keep into consideration.
Thank you. Planned relocation, 2 words, people-centered and resilience. I really hope that our discussions in the next coming weeks will really highlight that at the end of the day, climate actions can be defined by already tried and tested solutions from people on the ground. Let's put people at the center, and then people's perspectives, people's values, and people's culture at the center of our work. And at the end of the day, our endpoint is not about relocation, planned relocation. Our endpoint is resilience. It's not even about adaptation. Our endpoint is really finding that solution that will really help communities, peoples, individuals, and governments to transform and then find resilient and sustainable solutions to our climate problem. One institution cannot do it alone. We have to put all our efforts together and really collectively identify and shape the future that we want to have in this climate space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Donna. We indeed are all together in this. And it's amazing to see the community sharing resources, but there is a lot that needs to be done, as you rightly said. That brings me to Tony. First of all, to the audience, we are really sorry. We are going a few minutes extra, so bear with us maybe for 2 more minutes at the most. Tony, what would be the message that you want us to take home with?
I think in some ways I will mirror what Donna said. I think the role of affected peoples, the issue of continuity, so that in effect you are moving not from A to Z, but that in effect you can move through a series of processes that make sense in terms of what you understand and know. Not the idea of preservation, but the idea of that's impossible. Something just came up in this discussion. I think the importance on the part of institutions is flexibility. Institutions involved in relocation and resettlement should expect surprises. On-the-ground realities do not fit. No matter how carefully constructed these categories are, you can expect surprises because resettlement is a process that transpires over time, and it is subject to innumerable pressures and variables that are not entirely predictable. So they have to be flexible if they want to be effective.
Thank you so much. Now, this question of flexibility, again, for me, it's always, attribution, quantification. These questions that we grapple with are very essential to a lot of work we do. Thanks a lot for highlighting these again. David, last word to you, your take-home message, and I don't know if you want to also share a bit about what comes tomorrow.
I think a lot of the questions that have come up this week in this hour and a half we'll treat in more depth. We'll have more time to dig into methods, into national level discussions, into the question of resistance, in terms of perspectives from the ground, different methods for researchers. So I really invite you to look at the program. We've got a lot of sessions, and for anyone who is Francophone among us, we also have a dedicated general session on Thursday morning. Germany time. My takeaways, I'll be very brief so that we can close. I think one of the things that really struck me reading, learning in preparation for all of this is that there is already a great wealth of knowledge out there. Some of it is from other sort of historical contexts, from a great diversity of places, and I think it's really valuable, especially for researchers at this particular point in time, to connect with each other, to share and do comparative work, and to look back also at cases from the past to try and assess how things have gone. So comparative long-term work. And the final thing maybe is also something that everybody has mentioned, but to be critical of the categories. We've proposed this one of planned relocation as a conversation starter, and it's clearly a very effective one, but we have to be very careful, and talking again from a research perspective, being critical of categories is not going in with a pre-assumed notion of what it looks like, being open to surprises, as Anthony has just said, and being open to changing the frameworks that we use.
Thank you.
What I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks a lot, Tony, Rachel, Donna. everyone, Renate as well, for amazing support and guidance you have provided us today. And most importantly, thanks everyone for staying with us. Do join us tomorrow. And with this, we look forward to seeing you again. Please take care of yourself and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for joining.
Been great. Thank you.